Welcome to this week's edition of Next Steps Forward. I'm your host, Chris Meek. It's great to have you with us again, and it's always fun to reconnect with a dear friend. Today's guest is a remarkable woman who brings a wealth of experience in what it takes to overcome obstacles, triumph through adversity, and achieve personal empowerment. And she's making her second appearance on Next Steps Forward after joining us for the first time in March of 2022, which I can't believe. Ruth Rathblott is a TEDx speaker and the author of two best-selling books. Single-handedly, Learning to Unhide and Embrace Connection was published in 2022, and her latest book, Unhide and Seek, Live Your Best Life, Do Your Best Work, was released just last month. Ruth has spent her entire career focused on providing opportunities for those who face obstacles. She's been a leader in nonprofit organizations for more than 25 years, 15 of which she spent at Big Brothers Big Sisters of New York City. Ruth is also the former president and CEO of the Harlem Educational Activities Fund, and she currently serves on the Goucher College Board of Trustees and is a board member of the Lucky Finn Project, which raises awareness and celebrates children and adults born with limb differences. Ruth Rathblott, welcome back to Next Steps Forward.
It's the best part of my day. Best part of my day, Chris.
March of 2022. What happened?
That seemed like forever ago.
2.5 years ago?
Seems like a lot. It seems like a long time, and it also seems like a short time. Because
absolutely agree. Yeah. I agree. So just as we did in March of 22, let's start a conversation at the beginning, and specifically your beginning. You were born with a limb that didn't fully develop. How does that happen, and how did it affect you?
Sure. They're not actually sure how it happened. It's called amniotic band syndrome, and it's basically, Chris, where a protein band wraps around the development of a limb. It can affect hands, it can affect legs, it can affect different parts of the body. For me, it affected my left hand. For your audience, I was born missing part of my left hand. It didn't grow formally and officially, fully.
And what percentage of babies are born with limb differences?
Yeah, the statistics out there right now are about 1 in 1,500 or 1 in 3,000. There's still some science behind that research of it's between 1,500 and 3,000, one in.
And you were born in pre-sonogram days, and your limb difference wasn't known until you were born.
Correct.
How did your parents react when they learned of your limb difference, and what advice did they receive, including from one nurse in particular, about how they should raise you?
It was, so not to date me, but it was the days before sonograms. And even apparently, according to some of the moms that I've talked to through the Lucky Finn Project and other limb difference organizations, not everyone knows, even with sonograms, about the limb difference. And so when I was born, it was a time where there was not a lot of knowledge about this. And the doctor immediately and the nurses immediately rushed me out of the room to kind of clean me, that's what they said. And the doctor took my father outside into the hallway to explain what happened, and so that he could go back in and comfort my mom. And as they started to talk about it, it's a shock for any child to be born with a difference. It's a shock first to have a child be born, right? That's a whole process in itself. Then you have a child with a physical difference. How do you understand that when you're not prepared for that? And so the doctor took my father outside the room. They came back in, talked to my mother, obviously, and knowingly now, my parents were upset, were shocked by it. And luckily in that room, there was a nurse who said, you know what you're going to do? You're going to take this little girl home. You're going to love her, and you're going to treat her as you would any other child. And Chris, that's exactly what my parents did. They took me home. They encouraged me to try everything. This was part of the norm. I was no different.
I love that part of the story. Amazing woman. So I recall that you started hiding your disability when you were 13 years old. And you've said that hiding it even became your top priority. What caused you to decide that you were no longer going to do it?
Yeah. So that exit from the hospital and all those good feelings about you can do anything, you try everything. The one space that I would say, and probably to your audience and your listeners, Chris, is there was a piece that was missing. And it was, how do we open up the conversation about the difference? Because it was there, even though I was, again, encouraged to try everything and act, quote unquote, normal, that this was normal. There was something obvious that it wasn't normal totally, right? It was part of me that was different. And so that space of talking about it was a little bit missing from this conversation or from this in the time. And so at 13, when I started a new high school, a lot like many of us, Chris, who start new schools or new jobs or just even moving into a new community, we want to connect with people. We want to fit in. And I got on the yellow school bus that day to go to this new high school, and I was 13. And someone stared just a little bit too long at my hand, and they noticed it. And my impulsive reaction was to take my little hand and tuck it into my pocket, kind of just for that day. And as I started going through high school, I kept hiding it and not knowing how to unhide it, not knowing how to share it with people, because I thought people would think it was different. I thought people would think it was disgusting. I thought people would think it was a monstrous. Like, I had built up all these ideas in my head, and that hiding followed me from high school onto college, onto careers, to dating relationships. And it wasn't until I got to a point, Chris, of thinking, this is holding me back from dating. This is holding me back from connecting with people. And so when you ask about that moment, it was probably a series of moments, but the moment where I realized I'm putting up all these walls, because when we hide parts of ourselves, it's exhausting and it's lonely, but it keeps us feeling disconnected from others and from ourselves. And so you put up these walls thinking, I'm the only one that feels different. I can't show anyone. I can't tell anyone about my difference. And Chris, most of us are hiding something. And that's what I have come to find out now through my journey of unhiding. But I will say the impetus to this unhiding was this idea of I wasn't forming connections and relationships in dating. And I went to therapy and started to unpack that. And what did that mean? And luckily for me, I met someone who I invited in to start to share part of that journey of how to unhide. He taught me how to unhide.
Weren't you lonely all those years?
Yeah. It's funny. I think, yes, because I think hiding is lonely. And yet there's almost a facade that you're fine, right? Because we start to accept that this is the way life is. And I've had people, Chris, share with me that they hide their mental health. They hide their education backgrounds. They hide their financial security. They hide their relationship status, religion. I mean, think about where we are today in 2024. People hide their politics, So it's a sense of loneliness because you think you're the only one with that difference of any of those things I mentioned. And yet it doesn't mean you're not meeting people and making connections. It's just, how deep are those connections? How well do they truly know you? And if they find out that piece of you, this is the big fear. If they find out that piece of you, they'll reject you or judge you. And so that's what you walk around with. That's the loneliness piece, is if I tell somebody, they'll reject me or judge me.
Your first book was about your journey of unhiding after 25 years of hiding your limb difference. So before we get into unhide and seek, would you share that journey with us? And unhiding is your term, beyond the obvious of not hiding, what does it mean for somebody to unhide?
Unhiding is freedom. It's the best equation I have for it. It's the idea of, how do you bring back joy into your life? How do you bring back freedom? How do you bring back this idea of just feeling like you belong? And so the actual act of unhiding is the process of sharing parts of yourself, those pieces of you that you may have been hiding for all those years, with someone. Just one person sometimes is all it takes, Chris, of just sharing that piece of you. And it's funny, the steps to unhiding, which I've created and are in this next book, but came about through my own journey of unhiding and then meeting so many people who have also unhidden. And it follows 4 basic steps. And the first is acknowledging it first, right? Because you can't unhide something you don't acknowledge and you don't see. So the first step is acknowledging it. It's that self-awareness. What am I hiding? How is it holding me back from connecting? How is it holding me back from thriving? How is it holding me back from belonging? And how come I don't feel seen or heard? I mean, I know for myself, when somebody asked about, my leadership and diversity and those pieces, and they didn't see me as having a disability, I got upset at first, Chris. And I said, well, okay, how come? Like I have a physical difference, like a physical disability. How come you don't see it? And what I realized was I hadn't shared part of my journey with them. So of course they weren't seeing and understanding that as piece of it. And I wasn't either. I wasn't acknowledging it. And so that first step is so critical in this process of unhiding, is acknowledging it. And then the second step, Chris, is the idea of inviting one person in, just one trusted person. And I imagine as you're hearing it and your audience is hearing it, there's someone that's kind of your go-to that comes to mind, right? It's the person who you trust, the person who has empathy, the person who asks questions with curiosity and who listens. That's the go-to person that you want to share this piece of yourself with, whether it's saying, hey, I just listened to this Next Steps Forward podcast with Chris Meek, and he was interviewing a woman who talked about hiding for 25 years and how she unhid. It's saying something about that resonated with me, and that sharing that with someone. And then the third step is starting to find others like you, that shared experience. So finding those people who, whether it's going on Google and just figuring it out and typing it in, and seeing what's out there, or finding communities, and building that community is that third step that's crucial after you've acknowledged it, after you invited somebody in. Building that community so you realize you're not alone. There's so many shared experiences in that. Chris, I didn't realize until I found my community that I didn't invent hiding of my hand. I thought I invented it. No, so many others did. And then the fourth step is, I think, probably one of the most powerful, which is the idea of sharing your story. And it doesn't mean you have to go on a podcast like we're doing here, or getting up in front of a huge audience. It can mean just sharing it with a few people, so that sometimes what happens is they see themselves in you, and they start to build their own journey of unhiding and thinking about what it is that's holding them back. And that's the journey, those 4 steps.
Well, we'd love to have those people who are no longer hiding come on the show. So I appreciate the plug there. So you were hiding for 25 years.
Yeah.
The first time you unhid, what made you do it? And did that individual accept or reject you?
Yeah, it probably was, again, a series of little steps. And I think therapy was a big piece in that unhiding journey, to be able to unhide first to somebody and ask them how to do this, how to share this part of myself with someone. And I was lucky because the person that I invited in as that second step was somebody that I really believed had, and definitely understood to have empathy, asked questions, was curious. And so I was lucky because that first person that I really started to unhide with was really open to this journey and allowing me to learn how to love myself and learn how to, Chris, I had never even looked at my hand, let alone touched it, let alone let anyone else touch it. And again, I think most of us have a piece of ourselves that we hold back, right? That we don't want to either look at ourselves, we don't want to examine, we don't want anyone else maybe coming in and thinking about it with us. And yet that's the beauty and the power of sharing that piece of yourself, is you do build a greater connection. You build a deeper connection. So I was lucky, that first person that I really unhid to. And again, I trusted that person. So it's not just random. And unhiding is not an overnight process. It's a journey. And so it's choosing that first person that you share with. And to your question, Chris, you may choose someone that you think and may get a negative reaction. It's allowing for the conversation or moving on to somebody else that's more trustworthy and that's a better listener. Because sometimes people don't know what to do when we unhide. They don't know what to do with the information.
They have to process it themselves.
Yeah. And so it's allowing for that pause, which I also think is a critical, they're almost like mini steps between each step, is allowing for a pause. How do you allow someone to ask questions about it? How do you allow someone to give you feedback about it and understand it with you? And that's a critical part to this journey, for sure.
We've mentioned how your first book was about your own journey. Your new book looks at the issue of unhiding through a wider lens. Was there a particular conversation or an event that prompted you to take on the bigger picture and share it?
Yeah, there were several. And it's kind of a twofold answer to that question, because part of my process in building a business and this movement of unhiding is to work with business coaches and coaches. And I was meeting with my business coach, and he said, "You know what you need?" And I said, "Tell me, because I'm willing to do anything. What do I need?" He said, "You need a book that explains hiding for someone that may not be ready for your story or may not know about your story, but that explains hiding and unhiding in terms where you can kind of just read through it and think about yourself." And so that business coach was the first real push to it, because I'd been thinking about a second book, and I have so much more to say in terms of I've learned a lot. And that's part of the second answer is when I share my story, people tell me what they're hiding, and their journeys of unhiding. And so I wanted to give space for some of those stories that I've heard to reach a larger audience in terms of, hey, this isn't about a young woman who had a physical disability and hid it, and it's an anomaly. We've never met that kind of person before. This is a universal story that, again, most of us are hiding something. We walk around thinking we're the only ones. We're afraid of the fear of rejection and judgment, and yet we're not alone. And how do we actually go about it because it holds us back from our potential, it holds us back from our performance, it holds us back from our connections. And so the stories that I gathered as I was speaking across the globe and people read for single-handedly also, I started to collect those and realized this was much more universal. And so that was a big impetus in terms of getting this out there.
What were the differences for you between writing about yourself in the first book and writing about other people and broader concepts in the second book? And was one harder than the other?
I know. It's a great question. So the first book, my journey, required a lot of introspection, required a lot of visiting some pretty painful moments in my life and thinking about those decisions I made, right? Looking back and saying, okay, why did you hide? I went to regression therapy to understand when was really the first moment that I could recall of hiding and feeling different and understanding that. So there was a lot of introspective work that went into the first book, and acknowledging and thinking about, again, when I wrote that first book, it was for my 12-year-old self. I wrote it to say, wow, what does she wish she had had when she was starting to hide and think about all of those pieces? What would she have liked to have seen? And what do others how would they get something from my story? Is this even a story that anyone would relate to? So you have a lot of, there's a lot of fear because you're telling your story, right? But you're not sure if it's going to land with anyone besides you. And so that first book was a journey for sure, an intense journey. And then the second book, I will say, not that it came easier, but it wasn't about me this time. And it was about, I really turned the tables to you, like thinking about those people and those stories that I've heard of people hiding. What is it that somebody would pick up this book and say, oh, I have felt like that too. Oh, I have felt like that. How do I change the message to so much more universal and so much not about me? So in some ways, it's easier to write a book about yourself because you're the person that's happening. When you write a book about for others, it's truly about their experiences and how can they get in. And part of that meant not only creating a framework and really putting down those steps of unhiding, but it also meant thinking about what were the reactions I get when I talk about hiding, and not just the personal stories. But Chris, when I talk about hiding, there's typically 4 reactions I get from people. And so that went into the second book.
So now you just mentioned that you wrote the first book for your 12-year-old self. When you wrote that book, did you find that you were still hiding anything about yourself, or that you had to resist hiding something?
I think hiding is a continuum. The journey of hiding to unhiding is a continuum. Absolutely, there are things in my life that I'm still cautious about, right, in terms of sharing and thinking through, like, how is it affecting how I'm connecting? How is it affecting how I show up in the world? And what I learned in writing the second book is I thought about the idea of strategic hiding, because sometimes it's not always safe to unhide, right? I think about modern day examples right now. There are religious groups that it doesn't feel safe, like the Jewish community, to unhide in certain aspects. There are the trans community. It doesn't always feel safe to unhide. And so unhiding is a privilege that I understood differently with the second book in writing it. And it's also strategic to hide parts of ourselves because it can allow for connection in a different way. Maybe not everybody has to know everything about us. And so there are some things that it's okay to keep sacred. And also, it's not always our job to tell other people's stories, if that makes sense. Like, there are people in my life that I would love to share a part of their journey of unhiding, but that's not my story to tell. So it was being mindful of that as well.
Random question of the day and way off topic.
Yeah.
As someone struggling to complete their second book, how long did it take you to finish your second book?
So this is the beauty of having a business coach, because they keep you accountable and they say you have 90 days to write this. And it is half the size. Like, so this book, Unhide and Seek, is a shorter book than Single-Handedly. I'm a very deadline driven person. So for me, it was, okay, I knew what techniques worked for me last time in the first book. How do I get this done in the second book? And it took me 5 months to really get all of it together and out there. But it's been a journey. And every piece of writing the second book reminds you of, wait, why am I doing this again? Like, what? Because I liked my first book, but what? I don't know if I need to do this again. I equate it to parenting, to childhood. Like, you think with the first baby, you're like, you know what? I'm never going to do this again. I'm good. And then somehow you find yourself doing it again. And you're like, oh, yeah, these are the pains and the labors and all of it. Yeah. So you got this, Chris. You got this.
We'll get there. So in your latest book, Unhide and Seek, you've created 4 archetypes about people who are hiding something. Let's take them one at a time so you can go into some detail about each of them.
Sure.
The first reaction is from the person who insists their hiding is not news to them. What archetype is that, and what's going on with them?
So that's what I call the guardian. It's the person who, when I talk about this concept of hiding, they know exactly what I'm talking about. They come up and they say, I know exactly what you're talking about with hiding. And so it's the space of, there's something in your life where you have fear of rejection and judgment. You fear that if I tell somebody this, it's not going to go well. So I'm just going to hide it. And again, it can be, Chris, like the things I mentioned before. It can be something, quote unquote, as simple as that you would say, oh, you don't need to hide your education level. Oh, you don't need to hide your finances or your relationship. And that may be true for the person thinking of judging you, right? But in your head, you've either gotten messages externally or you've given yourself messages internally about this idea that this is something that is going to hold me back from myself, from connecting, from a job. I mean, I had a person tell me they didn't talk about that they went to community college with anyone, that when the subject came up, they never mentioned it because they were afraid that people would judge them and think that they weren't smart enough. Well, they were smart enough because they got an education with less money. So let's reframe that. And yet they had told themselves messages about that, right? So it's that the guardian knows they're hiding something and thinks that it might be different. Like if I were able to reveal this, what could change? There's a little bit of the curiosity there. But that's definitely a reaction I get from people a lot is, I know what you're talking about, and I'm not sure what to do with it.
And the second is, am I hiding anything type? And as if they don't know that they're hiding anything, how do you define them and what's their story?
Sure. So the archetype there is called the wanderer. And it's the person who, this may be a new concept for them because they've been kind of going through life and this is the way life is. And they haven't necessarily given a lot of curiosity to this idea of hiding or unhiding, and again, hiding and unhiding, the reason I wrote the second book also is because, yes, it affects us personally, but it also affects how we show up professionally and those around us in our lives professionally, like who is on our team who may be not sharing something. And so that wanderer is the person who is curious, who says, huh, am I hiding anything? Like what would I be hiding? And then goes through, and in my book, I have a checklist of areas of things that you may be hiding. I have examples of other people who may be hiding. And so it's the curiosity piece with the wanderer that keeps them kind of engaged and thinking, I never thought about this before. I'm curious. Am I hiding anything? And how is it holding me back?
And the next is the type that insists they're not hiding anything. So first, I know a lot of people who tell you anything about themselves.
Yeah.
Is that type of person really an open book, or are they still hiding something even as they're constantly oversharing about themselves?
So you may have met this person too. I feel like I've met them a few times where they'll say the reaction when I talk about hiding is, oh my God, I don't hide anything. I am an open book. I share everything. So I literally named them the open book because they feel like the world knows everything about them. Sometimes with regret, like, oh, I probably shouldn't have shared that. That was probably too much detail. I shouldn't have shared everything. And sometimes there is blowback when we share too much, right? Because then people have information about us that maybe we didn't need them to have or want them to have. And it doesn't level the playing field there with power. I think what's interesting about the open book is that they are curating a facade of what we want them to see. Thinking that they're sharing a lot doesn't mean that you're sharing everything. It doesn't mean that you're sharing some of those deep fears or those secrets or those things about your background that maybe you feel like you'll be judged or rejected. And so for the open book, it's often a curated narrative that they're sharing. Like, this is, oh, I'm an open book. I want you to know everything. And yet, if you really dig a little bit deeper, there's a little bit more there.
And last but not least, you've identified a fourth type of hider that you call the fortress. How do we identify a fortress and what motivates them?
So I met a fortress, Chris, on an elevator recently. And I was talking about what I do for a living and how I speak about the idea of hiding and how it impacts workplace culture and work with leaders. And this person turned to me and they said, is this even important? Like, why are we talking about this in the workplace? Because do you really believe people hide things? Or isn't it really more that we just need to get the job done? Do we really need to show all of ourselves at work? And I said, I'm not asking you to show all of yourself at work. I'm asking you to be able to show your best self at work so that you can get the support and the camaraderie and the connection that you need to do your job successfully, especially when it comes to leaders. And it's also the person that I've met who comes into a workplace session and when I'm speaking and kind of has their arms folded in the front row, Chris, the person who's like, "Why I had to be here because my manager told me I had to be here." And like, I'm not even sure why this is important in the workplace. Can't we just get our jobs done? And I had one of those come up to me after a speaking engagement. And I said, yes, it's about getting the job done. It's absolutely that. And what it's also about is, how as a leader is your team able to connect with you? Because I think many of us grew up in a time where we valued and kind of learned this idea of old school leadership, which is like, keep people at arm's length, don't be vulnerable, have all the answers. And that's just not reality anymore. And I don't know that it was ever reality, but it keeps people from not necessarily connecting with us as leaders. So you're not getting then the best out of your teams or the most innovation out of your teams. And so I was able to challenge it a little bit back and plant a seed. The fortress is a tough thing because I think that there's a guard up, right? If I share something about myself, it'll be seen as a weakness. And it's changing that mindset of it's not sharing everything about yourself. It's being, again, that strategic unhiding. How do we share those pieces of ourselves that will allow our team to connect with us? That's the goal here. And the other truth, Chris, is while we can have a preference for one of these archetypes, right? Because I imagine as you're sitting there or your audience is sitting here listening, being like, oh, I'm probably a guardian. Oh, I'm probably a open book. The truth is, while we have a preference for one, we're actually all four of them.
All four. That's fascinating. Because as you're saying, I'm already picturing like which one I am, and I'm not going to tell you. I'll let you guess maybe after the show. But obviously, these are four different types of individuals, even though it sounds like they all got a little piece of each one of them in there. What's the appropriate way to interact with each of those four types of hiders?
Yeah, that's definitely in the book, because there are tools, and again, it's more, it's a deeper conversation, because I think each of them has a reason for their hiding, right? There's the idea of, with the guardian, there's a message that you've told yourself about this thing that's different about you, that if you share it out loud, there's rejection or judgment. So the first step, again, it follows those four steps of acknowledging it for each of the types. Acknowledge it, invite someone in, build a community, and share your story. And yet with each, it's nuanced. So with the guardian, I'd want to start thinking about how are you journaling about this? How are you seeking support? What are those pieces? Similar for, I would say, with the open book, which seems like almost the opposite extreme, because they're just willing to share, is thinking about what are those times that you have shared where it has backfired? What does it feel like to not share some information? Where can you be selective with what you're sharing and why you're sharing? So taking the steps to be what I call the self-centered, doing some self-centered work, really acknowledging it and being introspective. But I call it self-centered, not in a bad way, but centering on yourself. What does that feel like, to slow down and to not share everything?
You've mentioned boundaries a few times in the show. What about boundaries? We've had it hammered into our heads forever that we're supposed to have boundaries and we shouldn't share everything about ourselves. How do we distinguish between maintaining healthy boundaries and unhiding the parts of us that we should unhide?
Yeah, boundaries are critical here. And boundaries are important. And we have heard that for a long time. And so I'm not in any way suggesting that when you listen to this podcast and you get off of it and you think, okay, I'm just going to start sharing parts of myself with everyone. That is not the goal here. It is not a flip of a switch. It is not overnight. It's a journey. And it's about, I always ask the question, Chris, how is what you're hiding holding you back from connecting and thriving? And when I think about that question, it's then, okay, so the boundaries that I have up around that hiding part, what would it look like to share a piece of myself, a small detail of myself with someone? Would it help me connect with them better? Would it help me them not make assumptions? Because I think that's the other piece about hiding that doesn't get talked about a lot, is this idea of we make assumptions about people's behavior based on the thing that we've made up, that why they're not doing a certain thing or why they're not sharing. And a perfect example, Chris, is I had somebody come up to me after one of my speaking engagements and say, I know exactly what you're talking about hiding. And so that's my guardian. And they said, in meetings, I leave before the meeting's over because I have a stutter and I don't want anyone to know. And I've heard similar with people with accents have shared that they leave meetings or they don't talk in meetings because they don't want to be seen. They don't want to be judged. And what happens is it affects us in three ways. The person that is having that difference is sitting there the whole time thinking about, when is this meeting over? How do I get out early? They're almost forecasting the next step. So that's what they're concentrating on. They're actually not really present. So they're not giving you their best self. The second thing is the team now is making assumptions about you, right? Like, oh, this person always has to leave the meeting early. They never have any good ideas. They're not really a team player. They don't go to after work events. I mean, this happens in neighborhoods too with people, right? Like your neighbors, you make assumptions about why they're not going to the potluck or the street thing. Like we make assumptions a lot about people's behavior without checking in what might be going on for someone. And then the third piece, and especially as it relates in a workplace, is you're not seen as in leadership material. You're not seen as having the great ideas. You're not able to bring your innovative self to work or those innovative ideas. And so it hurts us in three ways when we hide. And that's what the boundaries piece is how is it holding me back, right? So yes, I may have, and I'll use myself, I have a physical difference. When I wasn't sharing it, I thought I was protecting myself and protecting other people so they didn't have to deal with it. The team, though, thought, oh, well, she's so guarded. And they didn't know about my hand. They're like, oh, she she's not really friendly. She's difficult. Like she has this wall around her. And she's not going to be a great leader if that's what it's like. And so then you overachieve and you overcompensate to have people see it differently, but it's exhausting and it's lonely. And so that's where the boundaries, it's a nuanced thing. How do we bring the boundaries? How do we allow for the boundaries to be blurred a little bit so that you can bring your best self to work?
Once we figure out what type of hider we are or someone else is, what should we do?
There's a lot of tools and resources in the book, Chris. The idea is that's the first step, is acknowledging it and then thinking about, so how do you start that journey of unhiding? How do you invite that somebody in? And whether it's a close friend, whether it's a manager at work, whether it's somebody in your community, how do you start to invite someone in to share a piece of this? And then it's that idea of building the community, because today, probably more than ever, as we know, Chris, it is so much easier to find people with shared experiences. Whether it's a meetup, whether it's a Googling, whether it's an employee resource group in your company, like there are so many places to find others who are on this journey. And then it's about sharing your story. So that's really the framework for unhiding. And with each guardian, with each archetype, there is a prescription plan in the book about that.
So you talk about all this great stuff that's in your book. First, where can people find you if they want you to come speak at an event? And then second, where can they find your books?
Sure. So ruthrathblott.com is my website. I spend a lot of time on social media, specifically on LinkedIn and on Instagram. So that's probably the best place for people to engage with my work. And then the book is available on Amazon and anywhere that you want. You can buy a book, and it's on ebook as well as print. And then this fall, it will be audio as well.
And again, that's ruthrathblott.com.
Correct.
Perfect. So Ruth, you write about strategic hiding in Unhide and Seek. What is strategic hiding, and how, why, or when is it a good thing, or is it even a good thing?
Strategic hiding is a term and a concept that really developed in the second book. I realized it was really important because, as we talked about before, Chris, sometimes it's important to hide part of yourself, because whether it's in a power play in a work situation, maybe you're going through a relationship crisis and you're also at work going through a bidding war or a negotiation for something. They don't necessarily need to know about your relationship crisis. Like, that's not a good time to bring it up. It wouldn't bring you closer, maybe, in terms of this negotiation. And so with strategic hiding, it's thinking about, why am I sharing this? How will this allow me to connect with people? How will it allow me to feel like I can thrive? Like, why am I sharing this part of myself? And at the end of the day, Chris, it's the idea of, how am I going to feel better when I share this piece of myself? How is it going to allow me to feel and connected to myself? And that strategic hiding is an important piece of this, because again, hiding and unhiding, it's not an overnight process. It is a continuum. There are pieces of ourselves that it's okay to not share with everyone. They don't need to know everything. But how does it allow for us to connect, though, is the real key to this whole equation. I think the other piece with strategic hiding is, and in the book, I break it down also around, especially in their professional settings, as an employee, why do we unhide, right? What's the best case scenario, and when do we not need to share? And also with culture, there's a difference in terms of culture and thinking about how we hide. Certain cultures don't really want us to unhide. It's not part of the culture. And so thinking about some of those pieces as we're navigating that as an employee, and similarly, how are we navigating that as a leader? How are we getting the best out of our teams? Because our job as a manager is to support our teams, to set vision, to get people to really build out what we're trying to achieve. And yet, when people are feeling like they can't be themselves, their best selves, not their authentic selves, but their best selves, and ask for support, that's our job as leaders, is to create those spaces. And one of the things I say a lot, Chris, is leaders go first. Leaders have to model this behavior that they're looking to have from their teams. I think for a while, there was a cliche, and maybe you heard it too, of we want you to bring your authentic self to work, right? Well, I don't know that we're actually set up for that. We don't necessarily have the supports and the coaches and the therapists in place to make sure that happens. And we also haven't had leaders necessarily doing that first. So we haven't created those safe spaces for people to actually bring their authentic self. So I argue instead for, how do we bring our best selves to work? How do leaders go first in terms of creating that space, modeling what the behaviors and the mindset that they're looking for, and so that we can feel connected to them? And then how do we create those spaces where, again, we can ask for support?
It's interesting you mentioned how we haven't really set people up for success as being their authentic self. And the one thing you mentioned was having the mental health support. Yeah. And there's an article in the Wall Street Journal last week on a company, actually, ironically enough, in the town I live in, called Synchrony Financial, where they actually, because the employees requested it, they have an in-house therapist. Yeah. And as part of their benefits and part of their paid compensation, I think they get 2 sessions a month, maybe. So it's great to see that companies are embracing it. They're listening to employees, that employees are actually elevating it to management. You get those annual surveys. What have we done good? What have we done poorly? So I just want to, they're not a sponsor of the show, but I just want to highlight the work that Synchrony Financial is doing. And just, from your perspective, I thought that's interesting because I'd never thought of that. They'll give you mental health wellness as part of your benefits, but not somebody who's 2 floors up from you can go knock on their door.
Well, and often, no, and by the way, I love Synchrony Financial. I actually spoke there a few years ago. I think they're great. They are companies that are doing really good things around this idea of how do we create spaces where employees feel engaged, where they feel seen, where they feel heard, where they feel like they belong. And so that's a huge piece because, again, that allows for somebody to get the support in-house when they need it. Because oftentimes, as we know, and I believe in EAP programs, but sometimes they're limited in terms of how many sessions you can go to. And so how do you allow for somebody who may need a little bit more? Or just what does it look like to train around differences? So that, because I think that's the step that's almost needed in a lot of this work, is how are leaders thinking about their own differences first, right? How do they think about the way they understand their own differences? How do they think about others' differences? That's almost the work that needs to happen before we can really, truly advocate for authentic workplaces. Is let's do the work on understanding difference and what does it mean to be different? And how do we value different experiences and perspectives? Because that's really the workplace I know that most of us want to work in, is where different perspectives and different experiences are valued.
Well, that's a good segue to the next part of the conversation. The first time on the show, we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was 2.5 years ago. And now since then, there's been a real assault on DEI initiatives. The USA Today story in July described how the anti-woke movement has caused companies like John Deere, Harley Davidson, Ford, Lowe's, and others to back away from, or in some cases even kill, their DEI programs. What's going on there?
I don't know. Do you have the answer? Because it's really, it's disheartening. And I think that in some ways with the DEI movement, we excluded some people from the conversation that needed to be part of the conversation. And maybe that's where some of the backlash has come from, right? This idea of we narrowly defined what diversity meant. And excluded some people, including, I will say, and this was when I did my TED talk, I talked about this, my TEDx, is the idea of how do we expand the conversation on diversity to include all different types and lenses of difference. And for me, that meant disability, because disability was something that wasn't prioritized initially in DEI conversations. It didn't show up. I think there was a statistic after Black Lives Matter ignited and George Floyd's death that 90% of companies jumped into DEI efforts, right? Put up the banners, got involved, spent a lot of money. And yet only 4% of those companies actually included disability, both visible and the apparent disabilities and non-apparent disabilities like mental health and neurodiversity. And so when we leave out a huge group, and disability happens to be the largest minority group out there because it cuts across and intersects with all other lenses of diversity, we miss some opportunities to talk about difference. And I think the same could be said with age. We left age out of the diversity equation. And so I advocate, Chris, for the idea of what I said before, which is this idea of how do leaders, because we know things in cultures typically don't change without leaders involved. How do leaders understand their own differences themselves? How do they understand others' differences? And that's the real work. It's this understanding piece so that you can build connections, so that you can build representation, so that you can build empathy. You build a culture of belonging but you have to do the work first. And it is homework. As a leader myself, I had to go out and do a lot of learning about diversity and equity and inclusion before I could really make statements and really think about it. And I hadn't done the work and that beforehand. And that as a leader, I had to own that and then think about it. I'm saddened to see some of the companies. I mean, I was saddened to see Microsoft dismantled their DEI department. I was saddened to hear the Society for Human Resource Management take equity out of their statement. And I also heard someone, and I will give him credit, John, I believe his name is John Graham. He said, maybe instead of saying the words DEI, because they're triggering for some people, right? And especially in certain groups, he said, what if we instead called it a humanity practice and started to say, this is a humanity practice, because nobody can argue with humanity. And maybe that's where the lens starts to fall. And we start to look at this work on inclusion and belonging as a humanity practice.
Well, and that's interesting because I'll say in parallel, or not quite the same, but ESG was the big phrase we heard a couple of years ago. People have transitioned away from that, and now they call it climate.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple of things in terms of those letters to ESG that people have different opinions on, and so that's created a lot of controversy. And obviously, corporations are looking to avoid controversy in the workplace and with and for their shareholders. And so I guess that's the new norm in terms of just change the name of something, and it softens it a bit.
Or add on letters, just keep adding on letters. So it's like, but why not instead expand it or reimagine it, and so that we can keep moving it forward? Because I think we can all agree that, and I remember reading the 2014 article when Tim Cook talked about his own sexuality and how important that he did this in Bloomberg. And he said, because we know that companies that value difference are the most innovative and the most creative, and they get their best out of their teams. So how do we allow, again, for that space for people to feel seen and heard, and that their differences are, their different perspectives and their different experiences are valued? That's the kind of company that I think, as we're employees advocating for things, that would be the culture mindset and the culture shift that I'd want to see and continue to work toward, for sure, with Unhiding.
You're not just satisfied with writing a book about unhiding. You said that you want to create a movement around unhiding.
Yeah.
Taking a 30,000-foot view first, how do you get that done?
Chris, what's your advice? Because I'm trying. I think, and I don't know if you have advice, so I'd love it. It's when you're ready. I think the first is having the North Star. And the North Star for me is this idea of, just like those DEI statements that we put up in companies around valuing diversity, what if, just imagine for a second, what if every company had an Unhiding manifesto where it said, you know what, in this company, we believe that your differences and your experiences are valued here, that we believe in a humanity practice, that we believe that leadership goes first in this. And in my book, I actually have a page on a template for an Unhiding manifesto, because I do think that that would be the movement of how do we accept difference? Because that's really what it's about. Because when we unhide, we create connection and we allow for people to actually feel seen. And it's a beautiful thing, because then we don't walk around thinking we have to hide parts of ourselves. So that 30,000-foot view is, imagine if every company, every workplace, every organization had an Unhiding manifesto that leaders and employees and teams adopted as part of the culture.
So you talk about the manifesto in the private sector. Is that going to be enough, or will it require some help from the public sector in terms of new policies?
That's a really good question. I'm working on it. Chris, I got a lot to do over here.
You're very busy. I know. That's why I appreciate your time on here.
But I know, and I want people to join me. This is not about Ruth creating a movement on her own. This is about joining together with those others who are creating movements around this idea of belonging and connection and bringing people together, because I can't do it alone. And as I named my first book single-handedly, because that's the joke, is you can't do it by yourself. You can't do it single-handedly. You need connection, you need community. And so I guess part of that 30,000 foot view is also who are partners who want to join in this space, who want to join in creating a culture of unhiding.
Well, thinking back, you and I had lunch earlier this year, and we were just talking about different things. And I made the phrase, the reference of, I'm looking to start a movement with next steps forward. And it's about empowerment. It's about well-being. It's about leadership. You just mentioned the word partners. Whether you like it or not, kiddo, we're partners in this.
I think I totally agree. I'm like lost for words, which is not always true. So I appreciate your support always. And yes, it is. I mean, I think this is one of the next steps forward. Absolutely is. How do we create an unhiding culture? And so how do we bring these worlds together?
Ruth, we only have a couple of minutes left. And as you know, guests always get the last word. Give us some advice about how we can feel more empowered, especially during times of adversity.
Take a deep breath, like I just did, because I think this adversity will always be part of our human condition, unfortunately. And it's how we deal with it, how we go through it, how we share parts of ourselves. We don't have to do everything alone. And I think sometimes when we're hiding parts of ourselves, we feel like, again, we're the only ones. And so as we start to let down some of those guards, some of those boundaries, we allow for people to come in and connect with us. And so that's the goal here, is connection. And if we can pause and but Chris, it starts with us. Right? If we take the first step in acknowledging what it is that's holding us back and hiding, that's how we make the movement forward.
I've said this a few times. My mother used to use the phrase, we can't change the world today, but we can change the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
You got a partner, champ.
I love it. And ditto, you have one back, because I have been impressed with everything you're doing and continue to advocate for you. And I love the connection. So thank you.
No, thank you. Ruth Rathblott, absolute pleasure and an honor having us again today. Great seeing you. Thank you for your time and sharing your insights.
Thank you. Back at you, Chris.
I'm Chris Meek. We're out of time. We'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.